are and the ideas involved in aid advocacy in Australia. And you will also hear about the value of, or otherwise, engaging the public and engaging our political elites in decisions around aid spending and the use of aid. Just to give you an understanding of how we're thinking things running today, each of the panel members will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and we hope that will leave us about 30 or 40 minutes for questions and discussion, of which I hope there'll be a great deal. If people have burning questions immediately after a presentation, please, and we can try and address them at that point, but otherwise we'll keep questions and discussion at the end of the panel. Presenters today, in the order in which they'll speak, are Jo Spratt, who is Oxfam New Zealand's Advocacy and Campaigns Director, although today she'll be speaking on her PhD research. We've got Ben Day, somewhere, oh, over there, Ben, who is an Associate Lecturer in the Department of International Relations at the Coral Bell School of Asia and the Pacific here at the ANU. Tamus Wells is joining us from Melbourne. He's a Research Fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences, University of Melbourne. And Terence Wood, who many of you will know, is a Research Fellow at the Development Policy Centre here at the ANU. Christopher Hoy was also going to be joining us for the panel, but unfortunately isn't able to, reaching out to our political leaders to try and help them to understand more about aid and its frame. Tamus will speak a bit more about that later on, but I highlight our particular interest in my time. Jo, please join us and start us off.
All right, so welcome everybody. Today I'm going to talk about the aid policy system. I think it's called the domain in the abstract, but I think I prefer the word system. I've gone backwards and forwards over the last couple of days. And I want to take the opportunity to dig in a little bit into what policy is. So what I present today is where I explored how aid policy goals change. And I use New Zealand case studies, but I think there's applicability here to Australia, and I'd love to hear whether you think so too. I came at this research from a practitioner angle, so really trying to understand, grow my understanding about how you can engage in aid policy to change it or to maintain the status quo. What I'm going to talk about today is my more descriptive work rather than my empirical findings, but you may be curious about my empirical findings, so I'll just give you the punchline. What I found to be necessary, at least in the New Zealand case, to aid policy goal change were individuals behaving entrepreneurially, attached to an ideas-based network, manoeuvring amongst the rules. And I'm happy to return to this in the discussion. But what I want to focus on here is my descriptive work about the policy system. So any realm or area of policy is a system of its own. It has its own particular characteristics, its own actors, ideas, and rules. And the relationships and the dynamics between these elements are what shape and policy processes are complex, and I think we're not granular enough in our analysis and our focus of action. We use blunt tools to try and engage in aid policy making processes, and we make our efforts less effective. So to advance attempts to really get to grips with the complexity of aid policy and aid policy making, what I'm going to do is outline a framework that we could all use to sharpen our analysis and our action, but also a framework to stimulate discussion about what the aid policy system actually comprises. So first I'll dig into aid policy a little bit itself, and then I'll talk about its characteristics. And you aren't going to be able to read this slide, but I just wanted to say that it is descriptive work, and I wanted to acknowledge these are the key texts that I use and I draw work. So hopefully if you're keen to read further, you can come back to this slide. I'm sure it will be on the conference website and take a look. So first we need a definition of aid policy, and the OEC DAC definition doesn't really do the job because it's very focused predominantly on the funds that are associated with aid policy. So what I did was combine the OEC DAC definition with a generic definition of public policy. And I have applied this to Asian donors as well, so it can fit across a broader realm of donors. So aid policy is the result of government's decisions, subsequent actions in relation to whether, why and how the government provides funds to, among other things, promote economic development and welfare in developing countries. And any policy is not a homogeneous lump. It's divided into different elements, and you can divide policy into these 4 elements that I've put together here, drawing on theorists below. So all policy is founded on what I call policy values, which are these deep worldviews and beliefs. And these policy values form the foundations for the more concrete policy sort of documentation or content, which can be divided into goals, objectives, and settings. And I'll return to this when I talk about ideas later. So aid policy has particular characteristics, and we're all going to touch on this one. So first we often talk about aid policy as though it was divorced from foreign policy, when in actual fact, aid policy is, because it involves a great deal of action beyond the borders of the country that gives aid policy is foreign policy. This is not always a happy marriage, but we certainly can't escape the fact that this relationship exists. A second, aid is taxpayer money, but the people that aid is spent to assist don't pay tax or vote in the country that gives aid. So this creates significant gaps, or more severe gaps in policy making than what exist in the domestic realm, an accountability gap and a feedback gap. So there's no direct accountability from the people who are supposed to benefit from aid back to the government that delivers the aid. They can't vote in the country, as I've said, they don't pay taxes, and they can't rock up to their local MP and complain about the local water and sanitation project, for example. This also creates a feedback gap. So it's very hard to gather good quality information about the impacts of aid. Both aid agencies and the general public in particular, in the donor country find it really hard to get good information about the impact. So there's no real good feedback loop there. So because of these gaps, there are specific politics involved in aid policy making. There's specific actors with particular ideas, and the power that these actors and these ideas have are prescribed by the rules, both informal and formal. So, and the dynamics between these actors, ideas, and rules in the aid policy system are in contestation with each other about what aid policy should do and could be. And the winners get to see their ideas captured in policy content. So you could graphically look at the aid policy system like this. So now I'm just going to briefly talk through the actors, rules and ideas specific to the aid system. So this one's pretty straightforward. In any policy area, there's a massive universe of actors, and I think in the aid policy system, they're more limited. So these actors cut across government and society, and certainly the executive dominates, both professional and political, so ministers, cabinet, and bureaucracies. But it's not just the aid and foreign policy bureaucracy and political executive, but also Treasury, DPMC, and the agencies that are responsible for the machinery of government. Interest groups such as NGOs and the sector are really important, and political parties are also key. They're often incubators for policy ideas. This hasn't been explored very much in the literature, but it certainly came out in my research. So these are the key actors in the aid policy system. International organisations do play a role, but I argue they only play a role in as far as domestic actors take up the ideas of the international actors and then implement them into policy. And for the governments of the countries that receive aid, I think they probably play, I haven't looked at this, but I think they probably play a larger role when it comes to aid policy objectives and settings. So I think the higher level, or definitely the values and the goals are more about domestic actors. And then finally, what about the public? I think that's a big question mark, and it's a debate that will hopefully come out in our session today. It's a big actor that we spend a lot of time thinking about. I think it's important, but only as an insurance policy. So long as they're broadly supportive, that's enough. So the rules. The rules are the stickier parts of the aid policy system. They're durable and harder to change. They're resilient. And it's the rules that convey power. They say who can do what and when, who can be or has to be consulted, who has access to resources, who doesn't, who makes the decisions, and who can't. So we have the formal rules, like key pieces of legislation. The most obvious one is the rules in the term of government, because to get a big change, at least an aid policy goal, rules can be informal. It's like those water cooler conversations, who gets promoted and why, like not necessarily on paper, but just the general cultural expectations. There was a bit of Richard Moore's session on Monday about the culture and the broader DFAT. And I think that indicated to me this kind of set of informal rules at play. And in New Zealand, under the previous government, Minister McCulley was reported to not like the word gender. So what that meant was nobody talked about gender in any policy submissions to the minister, and it dampened down the focus on gender in the aid program. So these informal rules are really important as well. And finally, we have specific ideas present in the aid policy system. What I've done here is group the ideas under the elements of aid policy, but I want to just point out that these ideas are present in the system all the time. They don't necessarily end up in policy. It's the contestation between the different actors with ideas with different levels of power conveyed by the rules that gets the actual ideas captured in policy. And while there are definitely new ideas emerging all the time from within and without the aid policy system, there are some that are always present, and these form some of our biggest points of debate. So at the deepest level, we have ideas about how change happens, what we think about and value in terms of the planet that we live on, what we think about human nature. And then more shallowly at this policy value level, we have ideas about national identity and national interest. More specific to the actual sort of documented substance of policy, we have ideas about the relationship between aid policy and non-development foreign policy. What the purpose of ODA is. Should it only be used for achieving development outcomes? Should it be used for achieving development outcomes and non-development foreign policy outcomes? Should it only be used for achieving non-development foreign policy outcomes? This is a big area of debate and discussion. And also here we have ideas about the kind of and authority that an aid program or aid policy should have in relation to other areas of foreign policy. And then we have at sort of in the other elements of policy, we have ideas about aid should be spent on what issues, how, through what channels and what mechanisms, and these form up object ideas. To summarise, it's a contestation of these ideas wielded by actors manoeuvring for power within the rules that develop the final content of aid policy. And this policy can be divided into policy values, goals, objectives, and settings. So that's my articulation of the aid policy system, and I certainly look forward to your reflections on that in the discussion time. We were asked to also provide one action point that I would really love to see the audience take up, and mine is know your system and work it. So I think if we're really wanting to engage in changing aid policy, we need to really understand the characteristics, the different elements of policy content and what you particularly are focused on, the different actors, the ideas they have, the rules, and then the dynamics between them. And to finish, what do we need to learn more about? Well, there's a lot, I think. And as I was talking through, I was trying to make a mental note of a couple of things in there that I'd love to learn more about. But I think the role of the public's really important. Understanding that is really important, and that certainly speaks to a much bigger debate and discussion in public policy more broadly. The role of the public is contested, but also, I think, poorly understood. And I think what would be really useful in advancing research is actually to look at what does the executive think? what does a political and professional executive think about the role of the public? Because then I think we might start to really advance our analysis. You'll note that I haven't really spoken about aid quantity, and I think that there may be different aid policy making processes, actors' ideas and rules, slightly different. I think we could look at that more. And then I also think about how we can create the rules, because these are the most durable elements. So how do we create the rules that support and nurture a high quality aid program? And I think that that was something I reflected on after listening to Richard on Monday. How can we really create these rules that are sustainable over a long period of time? So that's me. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Of International Relations here at the Corabell School of Asia Pacific Affairs will now, I think, take us a bit deeper into some of his work on the public views on this, the importance of the views of the political executive, which are both things that Joe has touched on, but we'll take a deeper dive now. So welcome, Ben.
Thanks, everyone. It's good to be here this morning. It's good to continue this conversation with here. So I don't know about going deeper than Joe. That's a bit tough because she's got plenty behind as well, I know. But part of the sort of struggles or challenges we've all been grappling here is just to understand, characterises the aid policy system. What are the politics that work? How do these in certain situations? So out of my PhD research, and the key question there that I was looking at was why do redirections happen in high-level aid policy? So the cases I was particularly a series of changes that all were announced in 2013. So in the UK, they had 7% spending target. In Australia, that's when we abandoned our 0.5% run-up formally. And also the Dutch abandoned 40 years of having 0.7% of the sort of agreed baselines which is going on. I was really interested in sort of understanding that, and the point I've reached now and that we're pursuing in sort of further work, these things happen and the context for those. So like the other presenters this morning, I'm drawing on a piece of research in particular, and you can find that online here at the Policy Centre. Discussion paper there and also a blog which sort of digests that a little bit more. But you can see from the title here that what I'm interested in is attention. And in my work, I've been paying attention to attention, and or not, I think it's it unlocks quite a lot of these ideas that are in sort of slightly different ways than they do in other policy domains. There's no surprise that people want to see change in their physical appearance. They join the gym, right? Sometimes those changes hold, sometimes they don't. But the notion of change comes from attention and a desire to pay more attention to something. And I think the same principles writ large are at work in the political domain. There's a whole bunch of interactive factors and different actors. But my current sort of focus of my research is how the politics of the tension, right, sort of in foreign policy broadly, but particularly. So this might help sort of people sort of, I guess, frame some of this today. But if we're going to sort of have two very kind of rudimentary models that to guide our thinking, model one would that political change occurs from a bottom-up process whereby changes in the broad public and public opinion filter up to our political representatives. They make changes, and that's why you see political change. So this bottom-up sort of theory, and much of the sort of democratic theory depends on this sort of idea operating in our political systems function in this way. We know, of course, that sometimes the opposite happens. So our political leaders determine sort of changes they want to make for various reasons. and sort of institute top-down change. So if a really crude sort of summary of my research, I think, is that the second model applies in the aid policy domain. So these bottom-up changes and trying to create change through generating more interest and more attention at the level of the public is not going to be anywhere near as effective as the other way around. So focusing on high-level elite decision makers and trying to drive decision making like that. Now, of course, there's links. It's not to say that public opinion is not important, and we'll sort of delve in more into that through the following speakers. But that sort of, I guess, encapsulates where I'm going. So a little bit like Joe, I'm going to try and frame here sort of the foundations of how I see the aid policy domain working, framed in the sort of the sense of attention. And the way these work is that imagine you're a high-level politician and you've got attention. I think this is a sequence of factors that would mean that you're very unlikely to pay attention to aid policy through the bottom-up filtering process. The first one is simply that aid policy has low salience. So while surveys will show that the public generally supports aid, this is much different from it being a priority for them. And so those distinctions are really important in terms of what politicians pay attention to. We can go into detail in Q&A potentially more on that, but this idea of low salience is quite borne out in a lot of the surveys which ask for the most important issue question across all jurisdictions, and aid essentially doesn't even register on the top 20 list in almost every case. Second one is aid policy is a discretionary issue. So what I mean to that is, in contrast to many foreign policy domains, the involvement of the executive is expected. So leaders are required to pay attention to high politics, but in contrast, leader involvement in low politics is discretionary. So what I'm saying is a leader is not going to get a phone call in the middle of the night about an aid policy crisis in the same way, like the Cuban Missile Crisis will work. So the existence of the state is not at issue in any of these things, and that has repercussions for expectations about executive involvement. The third one, and Joe touched on this, aid policy is complicated, and a particular illustration of that is this idea that aid policy is a Swiss Army knife of foreign policy. It can do many different things at different times and often simultaneously. And I think the reason why this is important is because it's just very hard to frame what aid policy does in many cases. So I think the public, when they're told that the Australian government is buying ships or submarines, there's a pretty obvious rationale and a reason for why they exist. Aid, on the other hand, can have so many different functions, and these can change, they can be interlocking. Aid policy is so valuable. It is also one of the reasons why it's difficult. The third one, also mentioned by Joe, is that the direct beneficiaries are offshore. So I think this has implications in terms of having political voting blocs in Australia. So I think that explains why aid policy and aid advocacy issues are so difficult. And so for me, the key question is, if we're thinking about advocacy, how do we get powerful decision makers to pay sustained attention to aid policy issues? And so getting to the point of following on from Joe about what are sort of coming from this, how do we cultivate top-down change, and what are my two suggestions for how to do this? So I think advocacy efforts need to focus on winning the hearts and minds of political actors. So how do you do that? Well, it's difficult. Tamas will tell us more about one thing that's happening, but the one I wanted to mention was Project Umubano. Now, this isn't particularly well known, but the Conservative Party in the UK really made a concerted effort prior to winning government or sharing government in 2010 to ramp up their project Unabanu, which was in Rwanda and later expanded in Africa. So huge proportions of the parliamentary party actually attended this, paying for it themselves to spend 2 weeks in Africa. And even by 2010, after the project had been running 3 years, 10% of the Conservative caucus in the House of Commons had taken part in Umubano. Those rates were even higher in the executive. And just recently, research has shown that of the 308 members of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, 61% of them were categorised as aid advocates. And I don't think that's kind of a figure that people would expect. But this study is sort of showing too that Cameron did a remarkable job at transforming the position of his party. And that was a long-term effort, but I think that's a really strong indicator of how focusing on elites can help to sort of instill change over the longer term. So the second one, and I'll finish with this, is we need to pay attention to political and policy rather than electoral processes. 3 sort of points here. Investing in the leaders' stocks of intellectual capital ahead of time. So you've got to know when is going to be the most appropriate time to make these interventions. So Condoleezza Rice, who was a US Secretary of State under George W. Bush, has explained how a policymaker's intellectual capital stock starts depreciating the moment after taking office. I think it's really instructive that Cameron and Rudd, who were both responsible for 2 of the biggest aid ramp-ups, knew what they wanted to do and had the frameworks organised before they became opposition leaders. And were able to run those things through those periods and then activate them once they came to power. Opportunities to lock in progress and identifying these choke points kind of gets to Joe's points about knowing the rules. The Expenditure Review Committee in Australia is vitally important, and also in the UK you've got situations where one individual being an aid advocate on a key committee literally determines whether 0.7% stays or goes. So with that, my time's up and I'll leave it there. Hopefully there's a few things to pick up in Q&A, but I'll pass back to Marion. Thanks.
Many thanks, Ben, and he certainly has started to get down into the nitty-gritty of aid advocacy in Australia and the complexity of who we're talking to, why we're talking to them, and how we're talking to them. Tamus is our next speaker from the University of Melbourne. He's done a really interesting piece of research, if I do say so, looking at specifically a project that Save the Children has been running for the last few years, where we've been specifically targeting those political elites about whom Ben and Joe have both spoken, to try and win their hearts and minds and to try and give them a real frame of reference for aid and the difference that it makes in the lives of the people to whom it is directed. So Tamus will now speak about that project and how it fits within the broader aid policy change debate that we've been unpacking here today. So welcome, Tamus.
Thanks very much, Marion. And thanks to Ben and Joe, both whose work I've drawn massively on in the last year of doing this research on aid policy. The question I want to be asking today is about aid has this very unusual form of politics, and Ben and Joe have touched on the ways in which it's unusual compared to other areas of social policy. So the question is, what does that then mean for Advocate Aid and Parliament project, which Save the Children has been running? And essentially, it's a program that takes Australian members of Parliament on exposure visits to political leaders, and they also meet with aid beneficiaries. They go and visit actual projects. So in the research, I interviewed lots of members of parliament and who had been on these trips, people from DFAT and other aid experts, some of whom are in the room, which is nice. And essentially we're trying to understand the ways that these exposure visits changed the attitudes and knowledge that MPs had. And then the question of, well, how does that translate into changes in the way that they think about aid being important, aid budget being important. I do want to make one point though before I go on, and that is that Australia has an aid volume issue in some unexpected areas. And what we don't want to do though is have aid volumes as the number one question. And I think it's been good, there's been some discussion about Richard Moore's review and how we actually need to be talking about the bigger picture of what's Australia trying to do, what is development, and what does it mean for Australia to be contributing to development in our region, not just with aid, but beyond aid. So yeah, I think it's really important that question's the top line question, and then out of that flows issues of how much money we need for aid. I think the sector perhaps has been a little bit guilty of having aid volume as the top line question and then having strategy as something underneath that. So even though this session is primarily looking at political decisions about aid volumes, we really want to make sure, I think we'd all agree that we want to have those questions, strategic questions, as the top level questions. Okay, so I'm going to make just one point. And if this is the decision-making process about, so we've got Expenditure Review Committee, Prime Minister, Treasurer, a couple of other senior, and they decide on how budget is spent. Members of Parliament get into that, and then citizens are the obligation of political leaders to spend money on certain things. We might think that, I guess at one level, there's citizens have rights. I'm a citizen of Australia, therefore up to my MP about what kind of services I think are best. But drawing on James Ferguson, who's a development anthropologist, he talks about social obligation in terms that goes beyond rights, and he talks about the importance of presence, that it's not just that we might have a right as a citizen, but we're actually there, we're kind of part of this electorate that we're in, and the Member of Parliament therefore has some sort of obligation. So example is, if we're thinking of children with disability, that those children might be Australian citizens and therefore they can make demands of their MP, but they're also present. They're in schools for kids with disabilities, and maybe the MP goes and visits those schools, or that Member of Parliament sees children around in their suburb, actually present in their experience. And so Ferguson talks about how also just the fact that people are there that builds this sense of social obligation. So what happens when we think about aid and aid beneficiaries? Well, as we've talked about, they're not in Australia. They're not Australian citizens, so they don't have rights as citizens. But the other issue is that there's no presence, not present in the experience of political leaders. And therefore, it's very difficult to think about how you build a sense of obligation for political leaders if they neither. But the issue is that, there's no claim on there. So what we try to do is we mobilise citizens. We think, let's mobilise people and they can talk to MPs, and I go and visit my local MP and say, I think it's really important that we give money to Vanuatu to help water sanitation or whatever. So it's acting as a proxy. We mobilise citizens to act as a proxy for beneficiaries of aid. And I think we'd all recognise that there's some limits to that in the two countries and see aid programs, and they meet with aid beneficiaries directly. They don't have citizenship rights. At the very least, they can have presence in the experience of those political leaders. And the research that I did was very preliminary, but I think it points to how powerful that is, that you can change the attitude of political leaders through that direct presence and that direct experience that they might have with beneficiaries. So advocacy is obviously an extremely imperfect science, so it's difficult for us to make decisions about it, but we do have to make decisions about how we use resources for advocacy. And from the evidence of the Australian Aid and Parliament project, I feel like it's really worth more exploration of this idea of presence-based advocacy and how can we use our resources towards connecting political leaders with beneficiaries to try and build that sense of obligation. So I might leave it there, and then we've got Joe and Ben and I have all been kind of in agreement about, or they agree with everything we've said. Oh, sorry, I've also got a copy of the report from the research that I did. If anyone's interested in that, we've got some copies here. Thanks.
Thanks, Tamer. I think now we're getting to the part of the discussion where we really are exploring the difference between and the relative importance of public buy-in, our political leaders. One thing I just want to draw the link between reference to Project Umubano in the UK, where large numbers of Conservative MPs over quite a number of years travelled to Rwanda and had direct experience of the work that was being done in that country involving the UK, and the Australian Aid and Parliament project that Save the Children's been run to give Australian parliamentarians direct exposure to the delivery of Australian aid and exposure to the beneficiaries who receive it. I think there is a really important link there. The Australian Aid and Parliament project hasn't been based on Project Umubano, but it's a really important link to make. Taken, I think, close to 15% Parliament, the current Australian Parliament, away on exposure trips, and that's starting to build the
type of message that might be effective in Heartland Australia might be a very different message from the sort of message that the Campaign for Australian Aid should use to motivate its supporters into taking action. And that's something that we need to look into further. And there is another question that we need to look into, which is, do people's views stay changed? So we've tested whether you can change people's views with information or not, found that you can, but it's always possible that once they kick back in the evening and start reading the Telegraph or whatever, that their views revert to their previous position fairly quickly. So we need to find out whether you can change people's views about foreign aid. And then there's one final question that I'd like to throw to you in the audience, which
is they've done a tremendous amount of work in this space over a long period of time. So you've got a great deal of expertise here. So do we have any questions? Oh, straight away. Tames is just getting marked up. Philippa, can you grow your voice or you?
I'm really interested in your conversation about presence and rights, and it made me think. So we talk a lot the public as being one group.
Well, especially refugee communities. I'm living in Myanmar, and I know that in Melbourne there's a significant refugee community from Myanmar, and they could be extremely effective, I think, in advocating to MPs. So I think that's perhaps an untapped thing that we'd be travelling to Myanmar to places where Australian Aid is going in as well. But I think you're right. I think there's ways of bringing in the presence advocacy in other ways. It's not necessarily.
Intriguingly, when I look at public opinion data, and migrants from developing countries or whose parents came from developing countries don't seem to be any more pro-group than the rest of Australia. That's not the same as asylum seekers or refugees. I can't test that, but you shouldn't necessarily assume, I guess, that migrants are going to be more supportive of aid than anyone else.
Do you have another question? You're up there.
Thank you. That was a great panel. My name's Lisa Denny, La Trobe University. And I just wanted to ask, my worry is that so much of our advocacy seems to replicate, I think, potentially unhelpful aid, either along this sort of charitable giving money to, poor children with flies in their eyes, and I think of NGOs I've spoken to are very upfront about the fact that they know that's an unhelpful image, and yet it does work to some extent and it does sell. On the other hand, we have the very strong, national interest argument. And my worry is that we sort of focus on winning this battle of, getting better advocacy, but we lose the longer war of we then have a really unhelpful, old-fashioned narrative of aid that creates the wrong expectations about, how aid works and so on. So I just wondered if there's a way we might, get around that, or whether we need to actually start trying to advocate for a much more of development cooperation and whatever else.
Yeah.
Do you want to start on that, Jo?
I mean, this is something I spend my days thinking about. And I think typically academic response is going to be it's really complex, but I think the framing research gives us a really good way in here, that we all have these underlying values that we carry around with us, which I was speaking to. And we can, through our messaging, we can tap into different values. And I think there's the potential for us to be using in our messaging values, tapping into values of universalism, solidarity, compassion. And research shows that most of us are motivated by this, even though we often think that other people aren't motivated by these things, but most of us actually are. So if we can start to tap into those and activate them more in our messaging, and that is possible but very hard, I think that we can very slowly accrete a population that has these values activated more. But I think it's, big and complicated.
So they probably have an impact on our views of the world. But it's also possible that the average Australian very rarely actually looks at an NGO advert, and that most, or wherever, I don't know which is, which of those two scenarios is true, but before I worried too much about it, I'd like to answer that question if I could.
Just as this, I don't know if you know, but Terence and I are married, so we spend a lot of time arguing about this. But
here we go.
Arguing against debating, right, Jo?
I just think if we're true to our mission as NGOs, then we need to make the effort. Yeah.
Mission, schmission.
The question here, I think, is next, and then one over here.
Thank you very much for the presentation this morning. There wasn't a great deal of discussion, however, on the role that the media can play, both in terms of picking on nonsense stories about, the whole national program is scuttled, but also in terms of making the discussion more intelligent. When you're replying, can you please consider the different types of media, the print, TV, and the social media, which may have very, very different dynamics from the other two?
Touch on media by talking about news story and the impact that had on your
which actually was a story that was just that the names of the journalists were fake, so to speak. I recall, I did look into the relationship between media consumption and attitudes to aid. There's a lot. There wasn't really a striking relationship. It might have been something like people who read the newspaper more, were more supportive of aid. Of course, we don't really know that newspaper consumption affecting their attitudes to aid, or it's just that people who are more interested in the world are supportive of aid and more likely to take the time to read the newspaper. Certainly there was no obvious negative effect of media consumption, which I guess is heartening, but yeah.
I was going to go, Ben, because I was
just going to say, more broadly in the foreign policy literature, this is still a very sort of hot button topic in terms of those diagrams I showed. Does it work top down or bottom up? And who does the framing? So are leaders responding to picking up from the public, and how capable are leaders of framing sort of foreign policy issues, and that's what sort of is the driver of the debate. So it's not very helpful, and would be like, I think it's instructive in terms of the role of the media when in salience of this issue, and it shows you, at least in terms of the media, kind of representatives of what they think is important and what's going to sell. It just doesn't fly. That's much more likely to have a corruption story related to aid on the front page than a launch of an initiative. And my sense is that corruption do so much as what's going on with it. So.
And can I stump on that and plagiarise some of your work, Ben? But the question of like how or rejection.
Aid and aid levels, quantities and quality, I think. And he looks predominantly, I think, at humanitarian aid, and there are other articles as well, and it shows that the number of deaths reported increase the number of aid given. So in the humanitarian realm, there's quite a lot of research in that space. But in terms of aid policy making system in general, they are an important part. And Van Bell argues that bureaucracy monitors the media as a signal to make sure that they're protecting their minister from risk. So they see the media as kind of like a proxy of public opinion. So there is that mechanism of action there, but I think it could be dug into more.
I think that one over there.
Thanks, very interesting session. Given the low salience of aid, it takes quite a lot for a political actor to invest. So my question is so we tend to use the stick and to be quite critical in terms of a poor profit. My question is, do we do enough to support and in a practical sense? I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I was at an event in the US, the 10-year anniversary of the Global Fund. And it was very, very striking the way the Friends of the Global Fund encouraged and supported political leadership, including by empowering actors and doing the sorts of things we're doing, but a whole lot more, and actually providing very informal secretariats, and that's particularly important for those who don't have any sort of departmental capacity behind them, giving awards, what it was that people were doing and how this was in the public interest and that these guys were visionary. And I just think we could be doing quite a lot on that. And there's probably scope for that to be impactful, because if you think about where we were in this country back in the mid-70s in terms, it took real leadership to convince the public that that was that was a bad.
I'd like to have a first go at that one. Ben?
Yeah, sure. I think I'm in full agreement. I think that, particularly in Australia, that to my experience in the UK and the Netherlands, the stick is kind of the approach, and high-level aid advocate is measured not so much on whether they're potentially engaged as to whether they come out in favour of 0.5%, at least until that dissolved. The UK is familiar with. I was really astonished how Cameron and Andrew Mitchell had a network around them, and of a sort of a closing in around them of key people and people you wouldn't expect. So my sense would be ultimately you do need to equip an individual who wants to do this. That's kind of the necessary condition for absolute change, I think.
And if I could just add something to what Ben said, one of the things that Save the Children has found as a consequence of running the Australian Aid and Parliament project, as I mentioned, somewhere around 15% of the current Parliament has now travelled with us on an exposure visit, which they have continued to be interested. They haven't just gone away on a trip and thought, oh, that was interesting, and now I'm back in Australia, I'm only focused on domestic matters. We've been impressed by the extent to which, and we've endeavoured to support in every way we can, both Save the Children and across the sector, these various parliamentarians with their ongoing interest in aid issues, but foreign policy, a great deal of interest in what's happening in Myanmar and Bangladesh in the context of the Rohingya people. And there's both an aid humanitarian focus on that, but also interest in that among the alumni who